everyone. Welcome to the third PANAAWTM webinar. My name is Sungyan Park from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. I'm also on the board of PANAAWTM, which stands for Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, which is a 35-year-old organization run solely on volunteer power of dedicated women in the academy, church, and society. We had planned to hold our 35th annual conference in April this year, but due to the pandemic, we shifted to this webinar format, which allowed us to bring these conversations to a wider public. In our first webinar, we heard from several PANAAWTM members on how they were surviving COVID-19. For the second webinar, we hosted the Academy Award nominated documentary filmmaker, Rita Nakashima, on the 5-part PBS documentary series, Asian Americans. We had thought-provoking responses from 3 PANAAWTM members and very animated chat box conversations. You can view the recorded session on our website, www.panaawtm.org. And for today's webinar, Asian American Activism and Black Lives Matter, we have 4 distinguished speakers who in their own contexts as pastors, activists, and scholars have organized communities to fight against injustices, both intersectionally and intergenerationally. But before we move on to these fantastic speakers, I want to just make a case here for supporting PANAAWTM. PANAAWTM for 35 years have been supported by grants and private donations. And this is your opportunity to help support PANAAWTM for the next 35 years of leading edge scholarship, ministry, and activism. In the chat box, you'll see an address to send your donations. Thank you in advance for your support. You'll also see in the chat box that Christine Pei is our chat box moderator. Please type your questions for the speakers using the chat box function. And I also would like to recognize the Volunteers of America for providing this tech platform, as well as tech support for our webinars. Thank you. So our first speaker, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, is the Senior Vice President and the Director of the Choi Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America. She is an award-winning author, and among her many publications, she co-authored Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War in 2012, and Proverbs of Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and the Search for What Saves Us in 2001. She is one of the original members of PANAAWTM and is currently on the board of PANAAWTM. So Rita?
Thank you, Sue. And I also want to thank PANAAWTM for organizing and hosting these events. I realized the other day that I've spent exactly half my life as a PANAAWTM member, and it's made my second half of my life amazing. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I am a Hapa Isehan third culture kid, which means that I came to the United States as a child from Japan. I was raised in a military family with parents who weren't the same race. And I grew up in a military culture as a dependent in a non-commissioned officer family, which was a culture that neither of my parents shared. So neither of them had grown up in the military or in the way I had to grow up. So I'm considered a third culture kid. And by the time I went to college, I had lived in Japan, Okinawa, Kansas, Germany, and California. And so when I entered college, I had grown up in an integrated military, but I wasn't particularly political. But the first 2 months of my freshman year in 1968 in college, a white supremacist group in Orange County, California, threatened to assassinate all our Black students on campus if they weren't expelled. And somehow the students learned about this threat that the president of the college got. And it turned the campus into a massive churning concern community of what to do. And it was interesting because, of course, everybody thought the police should be called, but the Black students didn't want that. And now I understand why. But at that time, it was a little bit puzzling. But people wanted to respect their views, and they weren't going to leave college. And so the decision was to create groups of non-Black students who would surround the Black students everywhere they went, walking around off campus. Nothing much happened around people with guns or anything. We don't know what the threat meant, but after a few weeks, things started to calm down. But what happened in those groups was that for the first time, perhaps, on that campus, Black students and non-Black students, and that was Asian, Hispanic, white, started having conversations about how racist the city of Orange was, how Black students sometimes couldn't get served in restaurants and places in town. And so the student activists formed a civil rights organization called, I think it was Students United. It had a very vague name, but it was interracial. It wasn't Black and white. One of the leaders was Japanese American, vice president of the student body. There were various kinds of leaders in the group that organized collecting data on the city of Orange and the discrimination. And when they had enough data, they went to the Chamber of Commerce and said, we're going to call a college-wide boycott on your town if you don't stop this. And so we were able to actually make a dent in that, in integrating the city of Orange from that threat of a boycott. Some of the businesses stopped being so racist. So I learned a lot in that first year. I was just one of the people helping. I wasn't a student leader at the time, but I learned about what protest actions can do. I learned about how you actually can leverage power that you have to make changes. And I was a pre-med major when I went to college, and I suddenly found science classes really boring after being involved in what was a kind of life or death struggle for racial justice. And so I was in danger of flunking out of school. And so I asked some of the activists that were leaders in the movement if there was any kind of class or anything that was interesting to take. And a number of them were political science or sociology majors. But every one of them, this is what shocked me, every one of them recommended one class. And it was called Literature of the Old Testament. And it was taught by a 70-year-old retired seminary professor named Willis Fisher. And I was a little puzzled why I should take a Bible class, but I decided I would. And I discovered this amazing trajectory in that class of the struggle for justice that went back for 2,000 years. That went back to the ancient prophets of the Hebrew Bible, that this struggle for a fair and just society wasn't some flaky thing that students in my age group were doing. It was long and deep, and it made me feel part of something that was really important. It also was when I finally understood who Jesus was. As a Japanese Buddhist family person, I did Christianity until that moment hadn't made a whole lot of sense to me. I didn't think I was bad enough that somebody had to suffer and die on my behalf. And I didn't understand why they thought Jesus was kind and loving, because he seemed kind of rude in the Bible. So I just suddenly, all of these things that had tracked in my life that I couldn't make sense of started to make sense. And so I wound up majoring in religion. I dropped my pre-med major. And that year and that Bible class were definitive turning points in my life that put me on a trajectory as both a lifelong activist and a scholar in religion, where all my scholarship has been informed by activist and justice work and peace work I've done as an adult all the way through. And so when I landed in the middle 90s in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered, I also experienced some of that Minnesota racism because of the Hmong community there. That was the poor Asian community in the Twin Cities. So they had similar attitudes toward Asians that Mississippians had toward Black people, which was very interesting. So I got very involved in creating an Asian American arts organization to do education around racism against Asian Americans. But I also wound up joining a predominantly LGBT church. And as a cis female, I kept encountering all my biases and prejudices and assumptions about sexuality constantly challenged in that church. And it was one of the most transformative experiences I had. It was an activist church. We were in the Pride Parade every year, and a people of color group was constantly doing things. And so even in that experience, there was an intersectional dimension to it, an intergenerational dimension to it. And as someone for whom gay liberation and all of those issues weren't in my line of vision in college, it took me a long time to integrate those issues as essential to my sense of justice. So I'm really grateful for the 7 years I had in that church. It really brought me around on all kinds of issues that were, I had never been challenged to examine. Then I did various other things, but I've had a long life and a lot of activism in it. But the work I'm doing now for Volunteers of America on moral injury, it feels like somehow all of those pieces of my life have come together around this concept of moral injury. I've been working on moral injury in social protest movements recently because of what's been happening. But I've always thought that moral injury is a piece of anyone who's out there in the struggle for justice. We know something of the pain of injustice, and we think it's wrong, and we want it fixed. And so I think the moral injury concept is rich and important because it breaks down old binaries, and it's hard to dichotomize. It's a much more inclusive term. It crosses into many areas of life. And one of the other pieces of it, I just want to read this little bit from an essay I wrote because I think it's intergenerational, especially in the ways that we're thinking about it now with Black Lives Matter and the long history, the 401 years of slavery and the history of what's happening with African Americans that's still in that legacy. And it's a concept that relates to moral injury called post-memory. Post-memory is a dimension of moral injury that dominates those who come after trauma. And this is a critique I'm making of atonement ideas, because I think the way Jesus's death functions in Christianity is a kind of trauma that's carried forward. Post-memory can affect the trauma in the past in people for generations. Reactions to trauma pain become the defining dramas of life, covering everything in the present that may give meaning and hope to life. When post-memories are placed in perspective so that they aren't an internalized form of trauma, but a memory of trauma, if they're placed in perspective, they can be understood and integrated as crucial information rather than as a driving emotional force. And it feels to me like with Black Lives Matter, we're in that moment of transitioning from the constant reenactment of trauma and the reliving of it over and over as a long legacy to really moving in ways that say, no, we have to fix this. It's not okay. This has got to stop. And that sense of that post-memory is no longer confined just to the Black community. That there's something about the murder of George Floyd that everybody had to witness for 9 minutes. that made that legacy of racism that was embodied in that murder undeniable. And so I actually, as a lifelong activist, feel more hopeful now about racial justice than I've ever felt in my whole life. And so this moment of activism for all of us in the Black Lives Matter movement feels incredibly significant. So thank you.
Thank you, Rita, for that powerful and for something for us to get our heads around in terms of moral injury. And there's a lot of chat conversation happening around post-memory, trauma, moral injury. So to be continued. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Chung-Ha Kim, who is the Principal Senior Lecturer and the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Sociology at Georgia State University. She is the founder of the Asian American Community Research Institute at CPAC's Center for Pan-Asian Community Services, Inc. in Atlanta. Her work with various immigrant and refugee communities have won her several recognitions, including the Women's Legacy Award of the United Way and Who's Who in Asian American Community Award. Dr. Kim is a chair of the board of PANAAWTM. Welcome, Dr. Kim. Chung-Ha, you're muted.
Thank you, Sue. I think a lot of us are probably zoomed out these days, especially when our children and youngsters are fighting in the streets in the middle of the surging pandemic. Yet, I do believe that it is important for us to gather and share how we're experiencing this momentous time. And I'm grateful for this forum and everyone who is on this Zoom session this afternoon. Thank you for caring. I'd like to share what I've been experiencing and thinking lately as I try to stand in solidarity with the people in the streets and their communities. And I made some notes to share in my 10 minutes. What is fair? What is the relationship between equality and equity? Why Black Lives Matter to me, an Asian American, and more specifically a Korean American woman? And what type of justice am I willing to work for? These questions became important to me as I spent stressful weeks juggling and deciding what I can do as the calls for racial justice took place all around the nation and in the world. And I found myself taking comfort and courage in remembering where we all came from. That is, the social category Asian American emerged out of a radical time and place in history, not unlike today. By becoming Asian American, from being called by others as Orientals, we were not only naming our shared experiences in our own terms, but redefining who we can become based on what we believe and what we do together as a people. It was this active and expansive understanding of who we can become as Asian Americans that enabled us to fight for justice then and now. Race or racial identity is not only what we call ourselves, but with whom we identify and link our fate. Remembering this very history of when and where Asian American category came from, I would like to share an eyewitness account of what took place in Koreatown in Duluth, Georgia, when the Black Lives Matter organizers decided to march from there on June 7th. Prior to this day, there were numerous rallies and marches took place all over Greater Atlanta area and beyond. There were several days of police usage of tear gas and 5 consecutive days of curfews in various cities and counties. The media also aired the broken windows of buildings and the looted stores in downtown, as well as some high-end shopping areas for days. And 5 Korean-owned businesses were directly impacted on May 29th, although the media only named one store. And that's the context for the People's March in Koreatown on June 7th, Sunday at noon. Very nervous and anxious Korean American community leaders, mostly men, were gathered to prepare for this march for days. And they contacted both city and the county police departments to ensure the security of the neighborhood and their businesses. And I know personally, another group of Korean American men also decided to act on their own in case violence erupts on that day. And this group of men has gathered a few blocks away from People's Assembly with weapons of their own. For them, the memories and the lessons of Sa-i-gu, otherwise known as the LA Uprising in 1992, were still too vivid, and they could not trust the police protection. In this highly charged political and emotional time, 2 encouraging news arrived a day before D-Day. One Korean American mega church out of 2 that we have here has decided to come out to show their support and to hand out 1,000 face masks and bottled water for marchers. And they made this decision as church, not as individual volunteers from the church. And a small article on local newspaper carried an interview with Park Sang-soo, a 91-year-old Korean American man who was a victim of Sa-i-gu, told the reporter that he planned to march, even though he cannot walk without 2 canes on each side. Like many Nisei, the 2nd generation Japanese Americans who experienced the internment camps, Park Sang-soo, with many other victims of Sa-i-gu, kept their silence about what they experienced, sometimes, often, even among their family members. What Park Sang-soo experienced on May 1st, 1992, I retrieved it from 2 newspaper articles. Some angry protesters ransacked their small grocery store as he and his wife tried to take refuge on the rooftop, and they were trapped there for hours. And they were almost killed when people attempted to set fire, and his wife was injured in the process. Like many other Korean American victims, they were unable to rebuild the business and became afraid of being in crowds of people and left the country altogether in Cambodia for 10 years before returning to Atlanta. And his name and his story did not surface until a day before a mass protest march was to take place in the middle of Koreatown, Duluth, Georgia. Some thousands protesters met and marched on that day. Many Asian Americans joined the peaceful protest. Several local and state politicians also came out to join them. After the march, after most of photographers and reporters were already gone for the day, this 91-year-old man took a microphone and said in Korean that he is a victim of 사이구 and that he stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. As the translator was retelling his story, an African-American mother who lost one of her sons to police brutality came forward and reached out her hand to Park Sang-soo in tears. And they hugged. And they were hugging. He took off his mask to fully embrace her cheek to cheek. And this embrace was not televised, and there were no fanfares. But I knew that I would remember this for a long time to come. And I found myself wondering what Andy Smith observed years ago, that the revolution will not be televised. In this time of Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, I wonder what type of revolutions are allowed to televise and to what extent. I wonder what kind of social changes and policies would enhance the people like these two to come together in mutual acceptance and understanding that their fates are all intertwined as one. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, then that's a simple and profound fact that we are all connected and that every one of us can impact the well-being of the entire community. While this pandemic did not create inequality, it is exposing the disparity in our society clearly and undeniably. It is with this painfully honest reckoning we are striving for justice together. In our work of justice, then, we should not put aside or dismiss challenging complexities and difficult differences, but we all embody historical memories and lessons we learned in life. And lately, I keep going back to what I learned from Lenny Grenier, civil rights attorney, about principle of taking turns. I would like to end my sharing by lifting up this lesson as a possible model for justice work. Lenny Grenier and her 4-year-old Nicholas was reading a Sesame Street magazine together. The magazine pictured 6 children. 4 children had raised their hands because they wanted to play tag, and 2 had their hands down because they wanted to play hide and seek. The magazine asked the readers to count the number of children whose hands were raised and then decide what game the children will play. 4-year-old Nicholas answered, they will play both. First, they will play tag, then they will play hide and seek. Despite the magazine's rules, Nicholas insisted that children play both. And Lenny Grenier writes, and I quote, "To children, it is natural to take turns. The winner may get to play first or more often, but even loser gets something," end quote. Then she critiques the conventional answer that relies on the winner-take-all majority rule. And she argues that the principle of taking turns may be better than simple majority rule in a racially divided society like ours, especially if it accommodates the values of fairness, deliberation, compromise, and consensus that lies at the heart of the democratic process. And I find this deceptively simple notion of taking turns as both a comforting and empowering source of hope. But I know when the crowds of people have gone home from protesting, and every time I may feel that my standing in solidarity comes at a personal cost to me, I think I can sustain my commitment to justice by holding on to this principle of taking turns. What about you? What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Jung-ah, for that moving and powerful reflection and introducing us to the story of Park Sang-soo and his remarkable act of justice work, as well as this principle of taking turns as model for justice work. So I hope we'll have more conversations about that later. Thank you. Our third speaker is Reverend Debra Lee, and she is the Executive Director of Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, a California organization dedicated to mobilizing faith communities into a movement for immigrant rights and ending mass incarceration and criminalization. Reverend Lee was a contributor to the PANAAWTM anthology, Leading Wisdom, Asian and Asian North American Women Leaders. And she offered a chapter entitled Wisdom Crying Aloud in the Street, which is a powerful reflection of her work. She is a United Church of Christ minister. Welcome and thank you.
PANAAWTM community and the PANAAWTM board for being such a nurturing space for me when I was a seminarian and as a minister, and just to have this community together. As I begin, I'd like us to hold in mind all those today who are inside US jails, prisons, and detention centers, especially during this time of COVID, when following CDC guidelines are not in their control and not in the realm of possibility. Right now, there are thousands of people in our prison systems who are COVID positive, and many have died, and in many cases it is spreading. Just want to bring them to mind and thought in our conversation today to think about how what we're talking about relates to their conditions and to their freedom. In particular, there's a family that we have accompanied in the last few months of a Korean man, Mr. Chung-an, and who died about a month ago while in immigration detention. He was 74 years old, and he'd been denied release 3 times from immigration judges and ICE itself, denied even though he had many pre-existing conditions, including lung cancer. And he decided to take his life after the 3 denials. Mr. An is one of many people who are being, and a surprising number of Asians that we might not think about, Asians and Pacific Islanders who were transferred from the criminal justice system upon winning release and earning parole and earning release, which he did after 8 years of serving his sentence, was transferred directly to ICE detention instead of to his family that was waiting for him with a room and with a job. And there he sat, seeing his death sentence as another condemnation. I would like to talk about our potential in this moment, the potential that we have in this moment as a country. When I think things are becoming clearer, I'd like us to think about how can we move the needle? What are the openings? What are the windows for deeper clarity and deeper solidarity? And how can we do our part to help push and transform ourselves and also to transform our communities? I'm a 2nd generation Chinese American, part of a long history of Chinese diaspora for many generations. It was kept out during the Chinese exclusion period, about 80 years during this country when Chinese were excluded. Had a grandfather who lived in Mexico and other places. And our family was finally able to come here as part of beneficiaries of the 1965 immigration reform law, which addressed some of the structural racism that was embedded in our immigration system, in large part in thanks to the larger civil rights movement and the movement for Black freedom to address institutional racism in this country in the 1960s. It is only then and that many of the recent immigrants that have come post 1965 in our communities are able to be here. It's only because of that. I'm also located on the Ohlone territory in the Bay Area, a non-federally recognized indigenous tribe. None of the coastal tribes in the very expensive real estate of California are federally recognized or have land. And I'm the spouse of someone who is African American and the mother of 3 mixed race Black and Asian children. So I want to remind us that there are Black immigrants as well as Asian immigrants, as well as Latino immigrants, that there are immigrant families that are Black families, and there are Asian families that are Black families also in this time. And so sometimes when I'm hearing in our communities, different communities, well, what about us? I mean, before George Floyd, here in San Francisco, there was a lot of talk about the anti-Asian violence that was arising due to the COVID-19. There are issues around violence towards Asian elders in our community as well. So I'm hearing this question about what about us? I think we have to ask the question about who is us? And who is us might be bigger, and I hope will be bigger than who we think it is. One of the things that this period has raised, I think, for us, for those of you who consider yourself part of an immigrant family, whether that's first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation, is I think this moment gives us an opportunity to think about how do we tell our story? What is the narrative that we tell about ourselves and our people and our arrival to this country? There is more clarity in this moment about the founding of this country. And we have to think about how is the story of my family connected, how does that intersect with the indigenous genocide, conquest, settlement, and continued occupation of indigenous lands? In California, when Chinese arrived in California, at that time, the indigenous communities were here. What was our intersection? As diasporic people, how do we relate to this land to which we are not indigenous to, and to the people who are still here, for whom this land is sacred, and who have lost autonomy of their land and their immigration policy? They're not able to control who is able to come, or to define what are the rules or the expectations of those who do come. One of the few references that I had growing up in Ohio as a Chinese, about Chinese Americans in history was this thing about Chinese and the railroads. But very little, it was only till very recently that I started to think about what our role in constructing the railroads and the impact of the railroads in the dispossession and destruction of indigenous communities and lands. The second piece I think we have the opportunity, if we tell our story in this time, is how do we retell our story in a way that intersects with the history and experience of Black America? We live in a system, and we have arrived into a system that breathes anti-Blackness and white supremacy. We have filled a place in the labor force on an economy that was founded on extractivism and capitalism in its most extreme forms towards Black labor and also the natural resources. We sometimes live in neighborhoods that border on other urban communities where Black communities live. We sometimes compete for the same resources. We sometimes establish businesses and have access to capital in Black neighborhoods. And do we know the history of those specific Black communities and what they have been through? Do we honor the elders, the stories, and the communities that have been there before we were, who have struggled to survive in America before we have? Are we stuck in our own identities, or can we move into a story of solidarities? As many of you know, this country was founded to be a white settler nation, and being non-white, being Black, being Indigenous, being other people of color is inherently dangerous, and it means being excluded. It means being subject to disdain, disregard, dehumanization, and denial. And in its most vicious expression is borne by Black Americans who've systematically been denied of life and breath. But our story comes into this also in terms of how have we been racialized as Asian? What has that meant in relationship to whites and Blacks? And for what purpose? And for whose benefit? So these are some of the questions that I think we have the opportunity to be in dialogue in our community about. And I think every time these conversations come up, we have an opportunity to go deeper. Our organization, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, organizes faith communities in California, 200 faith communities, and leaders in California to be engaged in the movement for immigrant justice and the ending of mass criminalization. Because we understand that our faith values call us to recognize the sacredness of every person, to be rooted in compassion and understanding, and to understand how these systems of immigration and incarceration are expressions of white supremacy to this day and the exclusion of life for others. Our goal has been to end incarceration, immigration detention centers in California, and be part of a movement that fully includes and values the participation of everyone in our society. So we've been addressing these two twin systems of immigration and incarceration. And there's the legal, for the Black community, being racialized Black means decriminalized through a legal system that ensnares millions of people, several generations now of African Americans whose lives have been completely entrapped and who find themselves in this system of engagement. Women are the fastest growing population of prisoners in our country. And the anguish of Black families that are separated for generations because of this system is something that I don't think we as a nation have really mourned and grieved. It is something that is addressed as an individual problem, not as something as societal grief and burden that we should bear. Following the period of mass incarceration, we're seeing the same processes of criminalization happen towards immigrants. Of course, this began with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Border Patrol, and the establishment of immigration detention against Chinese, but the current form of mass detention of immigrants, which is larger than any other time in history, is directly in relationship to the growth of criminalization in the mass incarceration system. So like the Black community, immigrants are criminalized. They're held in detention centers that are just like prisons, and even worse, because you don't have the right to a public defender. You don't have due process, and you could be detained indefinitely for months and years without ever seeing a judge. We're criminalizing asylum seekers, parents, and children. And we're criminalizing recent and new immigrants who end up living in over-policed communities, and the local police become the tip of the spear to ensnare people into a whole system of incarceration that deprives people of their freedom. I don't know if people are aware, but we're in a period, the last 3 years, of Southeast Asian raids, of the highest deportation rates of Southeast Asian refugees who came to this country because of US wars in Southeast Asia, who arrived to this country with very little resources, with very little immigrant integration, and ended up being, part of the criminal justice system. Many have been released from that system, have turned their lives around, and find themselves doubly criminalized now because immigration is going after them to deport them on top of, even after they have served their time in prison. So there are thousands, 2,000 Cambodians, 2,000 Cambodians, 4,600 Laotians, 8,600 Vietnamese who are subject to mandatory deportation, and ICE is systematically going to their homes to round them up and take them and deport them back to countries that many of them don't even know, many of them were born in refugee camps. So where does faith come in this moment that we have nationally to dismantle some of these systems that that do not serve the public and do not serve God. Where does faith come in order to restore a different kind of community healing and wholeness? One is I hope that faith comes in the addressing of fear. I mean, the system of criminalization is based on fear. And I think as people of faith, we have to address the way fear gets played, the way we are played to fear Blackness, the way people are played to fear immigrants and others. And that fear of that justifies the inhumane treatment and the suffering. It allows us to believe that certain people are not human. It's okay to deport them. It's okay to treat them. It's okay that they die in COVID in prison. It's okay that they're sentenced to 100 years in prison. It's okay that they have the death penalty, that they have life without. It's okay because we have this fear. And so I think we as the faith community have to address that fear. The other thing is I think we have to shift the narrative from individual blame and responsibility to collective responsibility, and our understanding of faith as we are a body and we are accountable for one another, we're responsible for another, and we hold each other as brothers and sisters. The third thing I think that our faith has to address the profit and business corporate system that is benefiting off of incarceration and immigration detention. It is another form of slavery and profit off of slavery that's happening off of people's bodies instead of investments and healthy kind of economies that are built on healing and health. We need an infusion of faith values of forgiveness, compassion, redemption. We have all sinned. We all make mistakes. We all are recipients of grace and mercy. And I know that were it not for the grace of God, go I to any person who is in prison today. We have a forgiving God, but we have a completely unforgiving prison system, a completely unforgiving ICE system that never forgives, never forgets, never lets you forget that worst day of your life or your worst mistake. It is harsh, it is punitive and cruel, and doesn't reflect the God or the faith that we believe in. These are the laws and systems that I believe should need to be dismantled. We are all worthy of dignity and redemption and inclusion. I think as immigrants in this country, we adopt the idea that we have to be good or we're not worthy. We have to be good or we're going to get kicked out. We have to be perfect. We have to reach the deaths of the murder of George and Ahmaud and Breonna show that you can be good. You can have done nothing and you still get killed by a system of white supremacy in this country. And we can do everything right. You can be a model. You could sign up for the military. You could be a straight A student, like we do as the DACA students, to try to justify that we're allowed to be here. But we have to let go of that argument that everyone deserves their humanity and their dignity and to be here and to be able to contribute. You don't have to be mistake-free and superhuman to have your dignity recognized. We need to unveil a system that sets out to criminalize and excludes. And restore people who've been set apart as bad people, bad immigrants, and restore them into community that they are part of us and we cannot separate ourselves from them. This also goes to the argument around legal versus illegal immigration. It's not about what we do that makes us legal or illegal, but it's about the avenues that are open to us. And some people are never afforded a legal way to come. As Chinese during the exclusion period, there was never a legal way to come. So we can see, and now we can see clearly that the anti-immigrant agenda isn't about, it's not illegal immigrants either. They're taking away, they've stopped refugees, there's a ban on refugees. They basically, they're stopping the H-1B high skilled, the good immigrant visas they're being stopped as well. It has nothing to do with legality, but it has everything to do with race and color of our skin. And the legal and illegal divisions are used to divide us from one another. So just in closing, I want to say my prayer is that we restore a system that's about supporting people, supporting families, about revitalizing and welcoming those who've been displaced by policies, often of our own. And we restore a system that's based on a different set of values that we can dismantle everything that keeps us separate from ourselves, that we understand that us, our concept of us goes beyond our own identities and is much bigger than we can imagine. It's much, that our God imagines for us to be a much bigger we. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, for your real thought-provoking analysis and, you know, about the twin system of immigration and incarceration and mass detention and mass incarceration, and what we as faith communities have resources to then fight against those injustices. So thank you for your comments, and I hope we'll have further conversations around that. It's so rich, so much happening here. So I'm really appreciative of the panelists so far. So our final speaker is Reverend Sungyan Choi Maro, and she is a first-generation Korean American and a mother to a Black Korean daughter. Reverend Choi Maro is the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which is the only organization building power with Asian Pacific American women and girls to create systemic change on issues such as reproductive rights, immigrant rights, racial justice, and gender justice, so we can live more meaningful lives. In this role, she currently published an op-ed piece in Color Lines entitled Solidarity, Not Allyship, a Call to AAPI Community. Reverend Choi Maro is a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA and calls Chicago her home. Sungyan?
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon with us, and thank you panelists for your really thoughtful remarks and just perspectives. It's been a while since I've been in the academia space, and it was so great to hear some of those words like post-memory and post-colonial, things that I don't often come across in the nonprofit sector. So it's great to be back in the space. As Sue mentioned, I am the executive director of NAPAWF, and we are a national organization doing intersectional policy advocacy and organizing so that Asian American women have more power in this country to be able to live more meaningful lives. And so in the current environment, you know, the layering of this, you know, swell and uprise of the movement for Black lives and Black liberation, and in the context of the pandemic and COVID-19, there's been so much that's come to light that has become made so much more obvious that people can't ignore anymore, right? Just the disparities, the fact that Black people, Black and brown people in New York are 4 to 5 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white folks are. The fact that 1 in 4 African Americans in this country knows somebody who has died of COVID-19. I mean, these are staggering statistics. And if you can't make the connections between that and what's happening on the streets, you know, I mean, you've got to be living under a rock, right? So I think we're living in some really interesting times and moments of really amazing opportunity. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and we've been wrestling as an organization, has been somebody put in the chat box, like, what is our role, right? Like, as outsiders, we're immigrants, or as people who have not had the same kind of history of being enslaved and having land stolen from us and all of this. And one of the ways that we've started framing and talking about it, which is the way we talked about racism all along in our context, but I think this the conversations these days really made it more important, is to really understand that it's all rooted in white supremacy, right? So the piece that Sue mentioned that I wrote, this op-ed piece, the crux of it is really that when as Asian Americans, if we can understand the impact of white supremacy on us, whether it was here on this land or across the Pacific Ocean, we are better able to understand and connect to this movement for Black liberation and Black lives, right? That our liberations are dependent on each other. I end my piece with a quote by an Australian Aborigine, Lila Watson, who says, you know, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together. And I really think that this needs to be our approach to solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And, you know, I've also encountered sort of the two sides. There's this one side where, you know, as also a leader in the Korean American community here in Chicago, where Korean businesses have been hit pretty hard. Especially, I think something like 90% of the beauty supply stores, which are in predominantly Black neighborhoods, have been looted and vandalized, right? And majority of those stores are owned by Koreans. And so there's been a lot of conversations at, you know, me as being part of being a leader in the Korean immigrant community, you know, talking, you know, people are like, but our community is hurting, but what about us? But what about, you know, and that's surfacing too. And then on the other hand, you know, I've been seeing a lot of sort of like shaming, especially like older generation Asian Americans and immigrants, shaming our community about the anti-Blackness that exists in our community. Don't get me wrong, anti-Blackness exists in our community, but it is rooted in white supremacy that has been taught to us through colonialism and racism. And I think the way we need to approach it needs to be really about how do we help our community understand and learn about white supremacy and have that analysis for the experiences that we have. And therefore, from that context, understand why, you know, why the way we have developed our worldviews around anti-Blackness is problematic. And so that's some of the work that we're doing now. And, you know, we've always tried to do, put much more intentionality around how we talk about racism in the work that we do as we train our leaders and our members. And we've really made much more of an effort and commitment to be intentional about helping people unpack white supremacy and that being a starting point. And I know that's like a really big word for folks and like not always like the nice safe space to start when talking about racism, but I do think that it's really important for our community to understand how our lives are interconnected in this way, and really want to, you know, I think one of the things that really, you know, got me thinking about all of this was I started seeing like circulation of, especially among Asian American groups, of the picture of the Hmong police officer who was standing by watching as George Floyd was being murdered. And that's horrific. I mean, I think that's horrible, but, you know, this quick jump to conclusion to own that as our guilt and shame and participate in not, you know, in the movement for Black lives out of guilt and shame, I don't think is a helpful place. And we really need to be able to examine our stake in the movement for Black lives, to truly genuinely understand that when Black people are free, that we will be free, right? That needs to be really felt at a much deeper level, so that we're not showing up the way white people show up as allies, you know? And I've been saying that to folks. I'm like, we're not white people. Let's not act like white people, right? Like sort of this ridden with guilt, let's go do something, you know, because of our relative privilege and proximity to white folks. Like, I just think that's a really, that's not the right analysis and right approach to engaging with Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives and liberation. I do think that when we really act out of this deep sense of how we are all affected by white supremacy and racism, and that we know that when we go out to the streets and march for Black lives, that we are also marching for our own lives. I think that is really something that I have come to feel deeply, that in our work, as we do intersectional work and work, you know, day to day, I interact with a lot of organizations that are led by Black women. And, you know, like some of the stories that Jungga was sharing earlier, just around like the experience of Korean marchers with Black folks, like that's really been my experience, right? That like, as we are doing this work together, that we're learning about each other's struggles. And in fact, yesterday, I had a mentor a few years ago, older African-American women, and it was really just mostly around like management and leadership. It was very work focused, but yesterday I was touching base with her about some consulting opportunity I wanted to connect her to. And she said to me, she said, you know, I've been meaning to call you because I watched that series on PBS and I didn't realize that Asian Americans have been lynched in this country too, right? So she's making this connection as she's learning our history. And that and so her and I started talking about how do we get more conversations happening between our community so that we're telling our stories together, where we see the connection of our experiences, so that it really is about fighting white supremacy rather than trying to fight it for our own, just for our space and our own self, and really getting rid of this mindset of like, well, if we say Black Lives Matter, then are we making, what about us, right? Like we don't worry about that, because we understand that we're in this together in a way that's much deeper than just, okay, it's our turn and then their turn and whatever, right? Like that every time somebody's out there, whether it's on immigrant rights, whether it's on reproductive rights, whether it's on education, whether it's on language access, that we all understand each other deeply. And I've been really, I've been deeply moved by how actually, a lot of our African-American colleagues have shown up for us during this COVID-19, the issue around racism against Asian Americans and the rise in that, right? Like, they're like, tell us what you need from us, tell us how we can support you. And I think that is really a sign of true, deep partnership that I really hope we can see across the country in various ways, right? Whether it's churches that are coming together or neighborhood groups that are coming together, not necessarily just, people in the movement, movement or whatever you want to call it, but like, I think we really need to start going deep and having these deeper relationships that really allow us to show up for each other out of generosity rather than a sense of scarcity or out of guilt.
Thank you, Sungyan. That's so powerful again, and you're really helping us to think about how we're all interconnected and how we have to act not from guilt and shame, but from a deeper rootedness of being truly in solidarity with each other. So I have some questions here. Well, before we get to the question, I want all the panelists to kind of show yourselves and just give an opportunity if any of you want to bounce off and reflect on each other's comments, because it's been so rich, so much happening, so much has been talked about in the last hour or so. And I don't know if something sparks something in you that you want to have a brief conversation with each other before I take some questions from the participants.
I'll start. Something that from several of the speakers that leapt out at me was that when I got involved in civil rights, anti-racism work in college, it was in California, where the dominant paradigm was the Black Panthers, not the Southern civil rights movement, which is a very sort of different approach to racial justice. And what struck me is paradoxically around what happened in California was that the white free speech student movement in Berkeley was inspired by the civil rights movement in the South, because Mario Savio, who was in that Berkeley movement, was in Freedom Summer, and he saw the parallels of what was happening to Black people in Mississippi happening to students at Cal. And so there was a sort of odd thing happening in California where the white students were inspired by the Southern Black civil rights movement, and the Black students were inspired by the Black Panther, Black Power movement. But what that Black Power movement taught me was not to accept white as a normativity, that you wanted to be integrated into or to become part of. It was always a sort of separatist movement in the Black Panthers that I really appreciated. I visited their school in Oakland, and the way they were doing education informed the way I did education as a professor, because it refused to accept the normativity of a dominant group and teach the literature and the values and the norms of a normative group. And it helped me also when in the 80s, there were some Asian American or Asian immigrant really theologians talking about liminality and marginality, that I didn't think that was a helpful paradigm, that I actually thought Gary Okuhiro, who also came through a Black liberation movement, his work on margins and mainstreams makes, I think, a very compelling case that whites have placed themselves in the center of American history as the protectors and developers of democracy, but they've never really believed in it. And they've never actually lived into it. And the only people who actually pressed for a real democracy are all those so-called marginalized, minoritized groups that have fought for every inch of rights that we have had. And that has not been this group and that group. It's been a whole major movement of minoritized people in various ways collectively through American history that have been shaping what we believe that democracy should be, which is to be ours as well. And I think that's really what we're moving more and more into, because the society has become so the white majority is going to disappear. We can see that coming. And I think the moment we're living in now is, can we do it differently? Can we be in solidarity with each other in ways that push forward a society that is actually a good society, that is actually just and fair, and not revert to bickering across groups or fighting for space or trying to create another new kind of normativity that leaves people out.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Any other panelists who want to jump in here? Debbie?
I have a question for Jungha, just that very moving story you shared about the elderly protester. And what is your understanding of was it a healing kind of action? What was your understanding of his participation?
You're muted, Jungha.
Yeah, just like I said, there are a lot of similarities among different groups of people who are historically oppressed or traumatized. So when I talked to his son-in-law, he said he did not know that his father-in-law was that traumatized by Saigu, because he didn't talk about it in the family. And I said, he was away from the whole entire country for 10 years in Cambodia, and then he returned to Atlanta. And even after that, he didn't talk about it. And this man doesn't even watch TV. So he didn't know any names of the names that we remember. George Floyd, no one, he did not know. But he knew that there are more than enough of people were killed, crucified, taken away. And so he thought that this is time. So he came out in many different ways. And for me, when he took off his face mask to embrace this African-American mother, and they were hugging with tears. And when I asked him much later, he said, I'm done. I'm ready to die now. So it's for him maybe as a personal healing of some sort that took place by participating and being standing together with standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter as a movement. But for me and for other people who have witnessed this is not only intersectionality of things, but it just comes to the realization and fact that we all belong to one human race. What comes around goes around. What goes around comes around. So, just like many of us actually talked about here, so-called their struggle is my struggle, and my struggle becomes their struggle. And that's what I learned from this man.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions that were coming up, and I know that Sungyan, I think you did mention some of this, but I would like kind of address this question to Debbie. People are asking, how do we become better allies? I mean, also Sungyan made a different, the differentiation between allies and solidarity, right? So I guess maybe how can we be more in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with, other justice movements that are happening? So I'm going to just ask Debbie.
I'll start. I think it really does have to start with locating yourself and your own story, right? And I think this is what several of the other speakers alluded to. You just can't jump into something else. You have to know who you are and how your story intersects with that. You have to be really clear about whose leadership are you following. If we want to support Black Lives Matter, they have 8 demands. Well, can we start talking about those 8 demands with our community? How do we feel about those 8 demands? Like, they are identifying these things as things that will make their lives remarkably better. And it's like, oh, okay, how does that intersect with our, but we have to know ourselves. I think that we have this kind of principle around accompaniment. Like there's a sense of like, you're accompanying, I think as a nation, we've been accompanying the Floyd family, through this incredible 2 weeks of memorials and processing, so how are we accompanying them through this ongoing search for justice and healing that they have, and walking with them, and just listen, more listening, more learning, and I think it's also, it's not just learning of like an other, but it's also learning of ourselves, and noticing like what's coming up, like is guilt coming up, is shame coming up, is our own story coming up. So I think that's some important things.
Yeah, and those are, critical skills for chaplains as well, right? So you're kind of naming accompaniment and noticing what comes up, and, how do we incorporate all that into our justice work? How about, I'll turn to Sungyan. Do you have something more you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good place. I do think that I'm really surprised. Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised considering how often it happens, but like Asian Americans really don't know our history. And I think that is definitely something that we should all commit to, right? Like it shouldn't, and most people who know our history tell me they learned it in college, right? They took a class. That's how they discovered, right? Like they didn't even know about Chinese Exclusion Act. I almost feel like every Asian American should do a field trip to the Japanese American Museum, like before they turn 10 or something, like it is really, it's almost a privilege to understand our history. And even regardless of when you came to this country, I've only been here 20 years, like I'm an immigrant, but I own that. So, because, when I go to the Japanese American Museum and I look at the stuff that white people used to do and say, it makes so much sense because I still experience those things, right? And there is, and I think it really takes away from this sense of isolation and, oh, it must be me, I'm the foreigner, well, it's because I immigrated, because I have a weird name. Like it takes away from that and really shines a light on the systemic nature of what's happening. And so I think that's like, if we're really going to be committed to racial justice and fight for this liberation, all of our liberations, but if we're really invested in movement for Black lives, yes, we've got to be on board with their leadership, but it has to be from a genuine place of understanding where we come from, right? Because my concern is that, one, either the novelty of it's going to wear off and people are going to go back to life, or second, they're not going to understand. Like I see this very often where Asian Americans the more privilege they come from, the more that it's sort of correlated, right? Ivy League educated, well-to-do, mostly East Asian Americans who are very well-meaning and involved in activism really carry this sort of like proximity to whiteness guilt when they get involved in activism, right? And many of these are like, have Japanese American family members who were interned. And so I think it's really unfortunate that it becomes so much of like, oh, well, they're more oppressed, so let's let them have a turn and let's let them do this. I think it's actually really about understanding how it's all connected. So I'm not gonna keep repeating myself, but I do think one big thing that we need to commit to and kind of figure out, like I've actually been talking to somebody about writing, not myself, but they wanna write, I'm supporting them, children's books about Asian American women, right? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the rebel girls who inspire us, but like, I want to do an Asian American version of that, right? Or Asian American version of that. Make sure Ryu Gan-soon is in there and other amazing people from across the Pacific Ocean is in there too. But I do think that like, there's such a gap in education for our community that our analysis and thinking around racial justice really there's a bit of a deficit there.
Thank you. It's a real indictment, I think, in our communities, and also a roadmap for us to that we know what we're supposed to do. We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate our community. We need to educate our children. So thank you for that. Any other panelists who want to kind of jump in here around how do we become better in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement and other movements of justice? Jung-ha, do you want to step in here? I mean, you've been organizing in the South for a very, very long time. You're muted again. Yeah.
Sorry. Before I directly address your question, I was thinking really intently of what our panelists were saying, owning up and understanding our own history and social location, and our own stories as well. So you mentioned my social location as living in the South. And so my understanding of Asian American history, I had to relearn when I came down to South. I did not realize how much of American history, so-called US history, is from Yankees' perspective until I came down here. And when I start to read Southern history, almost accidentally, but very surprisingly, I found a lot of in-between stories, or as a passing comment, here and there, a lot of Asian American communities were mentioned. Some of them didn't even use the term Asian Americans. There are sizable Filipino American communities existed before 1700. This is the late 16th centuries we're talking about. And there were Chinese, Mexican, American community in the South. But for Chinese Mexicans, because they're coming from Mexico as a geographical country, they didn't even know that their ancestors were Chinese Mexicans. So they answered US Census as Mexicans. And much later, they reclaimed their Asian Americanness. So there are a lot of stories like that. And not only that, when I started to take interest in sundown towns, how African-American families are okay to be seen in streets and homes as long as they're serving white families as servants. But they need to go back to where they came from before sundown. So there are a lot of southern cities are sundown towns until quite recently, until 1980s. And these sundown towns in the South, the way in which the white Americans actually experimented with Sundown Town against African Americans were experimented to Chinese Americans first. They were pushed out from their homes and their businesses as gunpoint. And they see the smaller size of minority communities that could actually control the entire region. So they ended up passing laws and ordinances for Sundown Town against African Americans. And so, I don't know how we start or where we start. Maybe we could start as an ethnic history in the US context or regional history in the US context. But, back in 60s and 70s, there were a lot of community activists who actually, it's not a typical textbook but memoirs, oral histories were written down. So even though they are dated, I think there are some places that we could actually start and restart. And I was also thinking, even in this panel list, that there are different generations, right? And Rita and I kind of represent or belong to a particular generation, and then there's a Debbie, and so on and so forth. So I was thinking, we know a lot about who we are and how we became who we are. And so even before going out to look for textbooks and other things, maybe we should start or restart talking about what we know. And we could connect this generational knowledge and wisdom as our own history. Perhaps since we're all women, maybe from a woman's perspective as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a question. I mean, we have about 7 minutes, and there is a very important question that I want to bring to the panel. And one of the, Julie Tay is asking, what are the limitations of solidarity? Much of what the speakers are presenting sounds like mutuality. Could that be where we ought to be heading toward? Is solidarity enough? Or is that a gateway to is it a gateway to solidarity? So I don't know. Sungyan, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was actually going to say that I think, I don't know that it's either or. I think that mutuality is what you need in order to get to genuine solidarity. And for me, it was more of putting the comparison between solidarity and allyship. And I think there is a clear distinction. And my main, point is that we're not allies because we also experience racism. It's different, but we do. And like this internalized racism, this idea that like, oh, our racism, the racism we experience is not as bad, so let's talk about Black lives. Like, I think that's not the right approach. That's the reality, but that's not the right approach, right? So I think mutuality, I don't know that mutuality and solidarity are necessarily should be juxtaposed the way I did with allyship and solidarity, but I do think that you really can't get to solidarity without the mutuality, right? So that's my 2 cents on that.
Mm-hmm. Debbie?
I'd like to just say, I mean, I think there's a different quality of the word solidarity, which is like mutuality can be transactional, and I think solidarity it's like becoming family. I don't know, that's how I would define it. And then when you become family, then a lot of things can flow from there. So I think there's this other kind of deep depth to it. And I think one example of it is, I think, we could look at the Black Lives Matter demands, but then we have to connect it to what are the things that we're working at? Like, okay, well, if we were going to defund the police, we should be defunding ICE, we should defund the wall, we should, these are the same systems that are targeting the anti-terrorists, around the Muslim community. So it's so I think we're not just limited to following someone else's set of demands, but we're adding our own, and we're coming up with a bigger picture that we can all get behind.
Rita?
Yeah, this is where I think post-memory is helpful, because when after 9/11, all that mass hysteria around Islam happened, and people were wanting to put Muslims in camps, and now they're putting babies in camp. I mean, when all of that started to happen, the first human rights organization to speak up on behalf of Muslims was the Japanese American Citizens League, because they remember the internment. So they have this post-memory, and they can see the same trauma happening now to other people. And so they acted immediately in solidarity to stand up for people because they've seen this before. And I think that's where a sense of history helps, where we don't think that we're unique because this thing is happening now and it's never happened before. We always want to say, oh, it never happened before. But no, we have seen hundreds of years of this on this continent, beginning with Native Americans. And they're also a little bit left out of the Black Lives Matter conversation, which I think is important to bring that in also, that we are all on borrowed land in some ways. But I think that solidarity comes from that sense that we know what this is. We feel it. It could happen again to us. It's not like we're doing it on behalf of other people. We are doing it on behalf of every one of us because we've seen this before. If we don't fix it, it'll come again. So I think that's another piece of solidarity is that you have a personal investment in it. And like as a cis woman, I'll march in pride parades and I stand up for all of the multiple gender identities and folks that are left out of things, because as a woman, I know what a gender as an instrument of harm is. And I don't want that to happen again. And I don't want it to happen to somebody else. It's not the same harm, but it's harm. And it's all one system of gender that does that harm. So I think thinking less in compartmentalized ways about how oppression impacts certain groups of people is also helpful for solidarity work, because it's on behalf of all of us. It's on behalf of the next generations. It's the people that aren't born yet. We're also fighting for, not just the past or the present. And that also gives you some imagination about ways to make interventions, right? You can think creatively, and we don't all have to do the same thing in solidarity work. We just don't want to do solidarity work in a way that impedes other people.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. Changha, you have the last word. You're muted.
I said, uh-oh. I was going to just say, sociologically, when we study people's movements and trends and generational, fashion changes and so on and so forth, is that, shared issues, topical issues, enables people to go out in the street. But what sustains those people is the bonds that we make, the relationship. So if we think about solidarity when we're protesting, that's something different. But the lasting impact on what that protest means to us when we come back to our homes and how we live our lives is the meaningful relationship that we make with our neighbors and other people. So there's, at least from sociologically speaking, there's some theories there.
Thank you. Solidarity and relationships. Those are two things we want to take away. Among many other concepts and powerful stories we have heard today, and also called for many of the Asian Americans to know our own history, which I think we all hear very loud and clearly in order for us to do the work of justice. So I want to thank all the panelists for your wisdom, for your continued activism, and for your efforts to change the world, and and for sharing your work with us this afternoon. And I just wanted to, Christine is saying here, I want to also just share a screen in case that you would still like to. We are always looking for. Sorry. I was looking for, the screen share is not working. So for donations, Christine is putting on the chat room where you can send donations so we can continue this wonderful work. So thank you all for showing up, and thank you for the panelists, and have a really good afternoon. Until next time.
I just have an announcement, which is there will be a recording, and it will go up on the Facebook PANAAWTM site and on our website. So you will be able to see the whole thing, and find the address in the chat if you need it. But yes, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.